talk is fortuitously kind of dovetailing a little with last month's talk about Edinburgh, and he's talking about being a medical student in 18th century Edinburgh. And he's very well qualified to do that because he was a student in Edinburgh himself, albeit at a later date. So please welcome our speaker, John.
Thank you very much. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Well, I'm pleased to be here, and as Terry said, it dovetails into the last session in that Munro features in here. But what I'm going to do really is, first of all, I'm going to give a little bit about Edinburgh and its university. Secondly, about the development of medical training in Edinburgh, hospitals in Edinburgh, and then students and their experiences. And so I hope you'll find that of interest. The medieval universities of Scotland were all established with the blessing of the Pope and the kings of Scotland. St. Andrews in 1413, Glasgow in 1451, and Aberdeen in 1495. In his will of 1558, Robert Reid, the Bishop of Orkney, gave an endowment to establish a college of law in Edinburgh. However, the bequest wasn't released because of the Scottish Reformation. And it was not until March 1567 that Mary, Queen of Scots, granted the town of Edinburgh all the lands, buildings, and revenues formerly belonging to the monastic orders, which had been abolished during the Reformation. In 1582, King James VI confirmed Bishop Reid's endowment, which enabled the provost councillors and their successors to build and repair sufficient houses and places for the reception, habitation, and teaching of professors of the schools of grammar, the humanities, the languages, philosophy, theology, medicine, and law. The college opened the following year, 1583, making Edinburgh the fourth Scottish university. We always thought of ourselves as the youngest Scottish university, but really before the deluge of the universities during the early 20th century. It's interesting that the only other two universities in England at that time, in the British Isles at that time, were Oxford, which was founded in 1096, and Cambridge in 1209. So at the time Edinburgh was founded, it was the sixth university in the British Isles. In 1621, an act of the Scottish Parliament gave the university the legal power to grant degrees, and so it had the same status as the other universities. It continued to grow, and by 1700, it had got chairs in divinity, Oriental languages, ecclesiastical history, and mathematics. And also regular instruction was being offered in medicine. Oops, I mustn't do that. You've been getting the pictures, you shouldn't be getting the pictures, there we are. Where I lost my place. During the 17th century, the majority of students came from the southeast of Scotland, but some French Huguenots and English Presbyterians came to the secular Toons College of Edinburgh. In 1505, the guilds of barbers and surgeons in Edinburgh petitioned the town council for a seal of cause, that's the permission to do something, to recognize their two crafts as an incorporation of barbers and surgeons of Edinburgh. This gave them the sole right of practicing their crafts in the borough. Furthermore, they were required to examine anyone wanting to join their guild for their knowledge of anatomy, complexion of the body, position of veins, and their ability to read and write. Would-be applicants had to pay an entry fee of £5 Scots, which at that time was equivalent to about 10 shillings English. And to provide also, as well as paying the fee, they had to provide a dinner for all the members of the Incorporation of Surgeons. So you're admitted into their body, but you had to feed them. The incorporation was given the body of one executed criminal to publicly dissect during the year, but they had to do suffrage to the soul, or pray for it, of the deceased. James VI confirmed the Seal of Cords in October 1506. One member of the incorporation would take charge of the public dissection and give the anatomical teaching. This was done in rotation so that they'd do it year to year, since they only had the one body which they had to eke out at that time. The incorporation took steps to prevent non-members from practicing in the borough. In April 1587, the deacon of the incorporation complained to the town council that Archibald Mard, an apothecary, had been practicing surgery by cutting and panzing of Matthew Wetch of one ulcer on his foot. And panzing is the Scots word for dressing, who were doing dressings. And he was fined 40 shillings. In 1563, the Provost and Bailies of Edinburgh forbade 4 men and a woman to indulge occupying or using of surgery or barbercraft until they were admitted to the guild. And in 1575, the Provost and Bailies issued a decree forbidding apothecaries and others who did not belong to the Incorporation of Surgeons to practice any part of their craft. And it's interesting that at that stage, the surgeons and the apothecaries were separate. But shortly after that, said that if they'd been examined, if the apothecaries had been examined by the barber surgeons, they could actually practice apothecary. And in 1670, the apothecaries were allowed to join the Incorporation of Barbers and Surgeons. So for a time, there was a combined college of surgeons and physicians. However, in 1681, the College of Physicians was founded. And the following year, the apothecaries moved from the surgeons to the physicians, where they remained. In 1685, surgery and pharmacy were declared to be separate employments and would not be practiced by one and the same person within the city of Edinburgh. Over time, the status of the apothecary increased, and they were considered to be of a higher status than the surgeons. Now, the first anatomical teaching was given in the house of the annually elected deacon, and this picture predates what went on in Edinburgh. This is probably what went on in Edinburgh in 1505 when they got their first public dissection. Here we are, just in a room with the dean watching over. In 1645, James Borthwick was named as Master Surgeon for the special purpose of dissecting anatomy for the further instruction of apprentices and servants. And in 1647, the incorporation rented 3 rooms in a tenement where they had a board, 2 forms, a green tablecloth, half a dozen chairs, and a skeleton. This is what Vesalius was doing about the same time. So he'd had slightly more than 6 chairs and a beige tablecloth. But it's actually quite interesting that this was Vesalius, 1542, the first edition of this. So they were having those sessions at that time. So Edinburgh was starting. In 1668, it's recorded that the surgeons had a garden for medicinal herbs and employed a gardener. And the following year, the incorporation decided that their rented rooms were not big enough, so they built a convening house in Surgeons Square. And in 1694, Edward Monteith, who was then Dean of the Incorporation of Surgeons, got a 13-year gift from the town council of those who died in the correction house and the bodies of foundlings, together with a room for dissections. So there was now a formal room provided by the town council for anatomical dissections. By 1697, the convening house was not fit to be used for teaching, and a new surgeon's hall was built, and their botanical garden was moved around the hall. Oh, I thought I'd just show this. That's Vesalius' anatomy. That's where I learnt my anatomy. That was the anatomy theatre in Edinburgh in the 60s. And when we went back for our class reunion in 2012, we were shown their latest acquisition, which is their computerized table, which is still in the same lecture theatre. They've now put leather chairs in. We used to sit on the cast iron benches, but still the same theatre that we were using, which is a Victorian theatre. Right. Now, where do we go there? In 1702, apprentice surgeons were required to pay a guinea to attend the botanical garden and be instructed in details of plants. Although James Borthwick, who was the gardener employed there, had been paid by the university as professor of botany for the previous 20 years. So they'd had a professor of botany in there. And by 1778, the Incorporation of Surgeons was granted its charter and became the Royal College of Surgeons. Their diplomas were recognized by the East India Company, so surgeons could work in India, and it were also recognized by the Army Board, so they could join the army, be employed by the British Army from 1806. And the barbers and the surgeons separated in 1845. They became separate bodies. Now that's surgery. What about medicine? In 1617, James VI visited Edinburgh, and some physicians proposed to establish a college of physicians in Edinburgh. The king supported this idea, but was opposed by the university and the bishops. In 1630, the idea resurfaced and was supported by King Charles I, who referred it to the Privy Council. But then again, there was opposition and nothing happened. Oliver Cromwell made a further attempt in 1656, and a document was drawn up for the institution of a college of physicians, who shall have power and authority to oversee, rule, and order what may concern the right administration of physic to the people of Scotland. However, the surgeons and others objected to the proposal, and the death of Cromwell in 1658 saw the proposal languish for a further 20 years. The idea was revived when Prince James, Duke of York, was appointed Lord High Commissioner in Scotland in 1679. After further discussions, a final document received the King's signature and the Great Seal on the 29th of November, 1681, establishing the Royal College of Physicians of Edinburgh. This was 97 years before the surgeons got their charter. Meanwhile, there was an ongoing argument between the surgeons, apothecaries, and physicians, when several physicians decided to set up a physic garden in Edinburgh. The surgeons, I've said, had been cultivating a garden since the 1640s, and they had a new one, another one around their new hall. But the surgeons had developed teaching anatomy, and I think the physicians thought they should improve the teaching of physic, because after that, that was their main tool. And it's reported some of the surgeon apothecaries who had much power in the town opposed us, this is the physician's writing, dreading that it might usher in a college of physicians. But by the great care and dexterity of Dr. Andrew Balfour and Sir Robert Sibbald, who were physicians, these were made friends in a design that assisted in the obtaining from the Council of Edinburgh a lease to Mr. James Sutherland for 19 years of the garden belonging to Trinity Hospital. So they had another place for a botanical garden, which is in Trinity Hospital. Sutherland tended the garden and the plants which Balfour and Sibbald had collected from various parts of Scotland and also imported from overseas. And Sutherland was professor of botany, and in 1683 he published that's where the botanical garden was in terms of Edinburgh. Here, if it's going to work. Yes. Here is High Street. There is the old botanical gardens. This is a map of 1780 showing the site of the original physic garden. Holyrood, for those who know Edinburgh, is over there. The university is down there, and the College of, we'll come on to this later on, that other one is the College of the Infirmary. There's Sibyl's book, the Hortus Medicus Edinburgensis, or catalogue of plants in the physic garden. That was the first sort of documented thing. And Edinburgh has the second oldest botanical garden in Britain. Oxford predates it, but then Edinburgh comes next, before Kew. In 1712, John Munro, who was a surgeon and worked in Europe before returning to Edinburgh, proposed the establishment of a seminary for medical education. He encouraged his son Alexander, who we heard about last month, who had served his apprenticeship as a surgeon with his father, that he should further his surgical studies and go to Europe. So he went to Leiden and Padua and Paris, and tried to learn more about anatomy. But he was actually thwarted because many of the places he went to, the leading people happened to be away when he went. So he went to Leiden and had some time with Boerhaave, the physician. And so he got his stuff, he got experience, he got his experience, and he returned to Edinburgh in 1719. And the following year, he was appointed a professor of anatomy. He was influenced by his father, and they circulated some pamphlets saying we really should be having a hospital here, an infirmary for people. And so pamphlets were circulated because John still had the vision of the medical seminary, but they needed to attract physicians. And so he persuaded his son that perhaps he should, because he'd been to Boerhaave, he was fit to teach medicine as well. But Munro said, Munro also laid aside the design of becoming physician by the advice of some friends, whose opinion he had great regard for, and who thought the business he then had as surgeon apothecary was far more lucrative than was to be expected by him as a physician so young. So the physician needed lots of experience first. And so Munro, they got some other people, some other physicians volunteered to teach medicine. And in 1725, the College of Physicians suggested that people who had money in a fishing company, which was closing down, they actually put their money into the fund to build an infirmary in Edinburgh. And the appeal was successful, and a small house in which 6 patients could be cared for was hired in 1729. And they put out an appeal for more money. They got a royal charter in 1736. Building started in 1738, and the first patients were admitted to the Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh in 1741. The surgeons, meanwhile, had opened a 2-bedded hospital, but 2 years before that. But they saw that there was benefit in being in a larger institution, so they gave the money they had into the funds for the infirmary, and they used the infirmary as well. The hospital was designed for 228 sick people. It had 3 floors, each containing 2 wards. There was an operating theatre which could accommodate 200 students. According to the Medical Register of 1783, this is a description, the earliest description I could find, it had 2 small wards, one for men and one for women, set aside for those patients who were to be subject of the clinical lectures. These were visited every day by one of the clinical lecturers so that the students have the opportunity for noting the progress of each case. And twice a week, a clinical lecture is delivered in the infirmary. There was also a public dispensary instituted in 1776 for the relief of such poor patients from the nature of their complaints are improper objects for a hospital that is supported by subscription. Because in order to get into the hospital, they had to be proposed by somebody who had put money into the hospital. So that there needed to be some the poor people who couldn't get that. And the medicine money collected from the students who had attended their courses. The students who had attended courses had to pay money, and that was money that was used to fund the dispensary. This charity must be more useful, as the infirmary has no establishment for the relief of outpatients. The two following physicians attend gratis every Tuesday, Dr. Andrew Duncan and Charles Webster, who were the two in the hospital. Additional professors were appointed in 1705 when Robert Elliot was appointed professor of anatomy. Charles Alston had been giving lectures in botany and also materia medica. George Preston was appointed professor of botany, and the following year James Crawford was elected professor of physics and chemistry. In 1720, the Faculty of Medicine examined all the candidates, and not as previously, who had previously been examined by the members of the college, by the College of Surgeons and Physicians. So the university took over examinations, and in 1726, they said a candidate who wished to obtain a medical degree must have studied medicine in Edinburgh or elsewhere for 3 years, and have attended lectures in all the recognized branches of medicine and attended clinical lectures in the hospital. So they had to do 3 years plus their clinical work. They were required to submit a thesis on the branch of medicine, and they successfully completed an oral examination. And the whole examination was conducted in Latin. So the basis of what we have today had been established. So and that was 1726. At the end of August 1734, 6 students in the schools of medicine at Edinburgh, and I quote, after having employed themselves during the 3 preceding weeks in the dissection of a body in the anatomical theatre, agreed to spend a social evening together in a tavern. After supper, it was proposed by one of the company that this literary society should meet once a fortnight, early in the evening, at their respective lodgings. That a dissertation in English or Latin on some medical subject at the choice of the society should be composed and read at each of these meetings, to which such objections as occurred to the rest of the company would be made, which the author must obviate as best manner he could. This association continued during the winter and the ensuing spring. And by the summer of 1735, the following year, the members of the society were dispersed because they came for a short time to Edinburgh and they went. But a couple have stayed on and continued having their informal meetings until 1737, when a small medical society was formed. It was formally constituted and had regular weekly meetings in a tavern, where the meetings consisted of a discourse on a professional subject of the author's choice, a consultation on an actual case, and an answer to a medical question. If members were absent without good reason, they would be fined. And the money collected would be used to promote the activities of society, such as the buying of books for a library. About 1742, the society was offered the use of a room in the Royal Infirmary, so they no longer needed to go to a tavern, so they had a room. And after the meeting, the members would still retire to the tavern for a convivial meal. The society continued to prosper and acquire books for its library, so there must have been quite a lot of fining or expenses. In the early 1770s, they could no longer accommodate their books, and so it decided to build a hall of its own. They bought some land next to Surgeons' Hall. The foundation stone was laid on the 21st of April, 1775. And the Scots magazine published an account that year, which was really seeking contributions towards the cost of the building. And the article commented, the assiduity and ardor in study, which is so remarkable in the greatest part of the students of medicine, has been especially excited and supported by the medical society. So the Scots magazine encouraged people to put money into the society's fund. The hall was opened the following year, and it was described as being 30 feet long and 20 feet broad, and 2 rooms besides in the building, one for a library and the other for chemical and philosophical experiments. However, the society needed recognition as a legal entity. It had property. In order to have it, it had to be a legal entity. So they applied to the town council for a grant to become a legal entity. But the university and the surgeons objected. So in August of 1778, the members, encouraged by some of their professors, decided that they would write to the king. So they petitioned the king. And they said, being a body corporate, they found themselves in difficulties in obtaining complete titles to their property and in securing and managing both it and their movable effects, so that they will remain with the society in perpetual succession. The king, George III, granted them a royal charter of incorporation as the Medical Society of Edinburgh, and it was sealed on the 12th of January, 1779. And so here we had the Royal College of Surgeons, who took 97 years after the physicians to get a royal charter, and here the medical students got a royal charter 3 years after the surgeons. And there is the Royal Medical Society's original hall in Surgeons Square, and that is the back of the College of Surgeons. And this is just where it was. It's a very fine building. So that's what Edinburgh had as a facility. Now, what about the students? 15 American students had obtained their MD from Edinburgh by 1765. In that year, of the total of 13 medical graduates, 5 were from Scotland, 5 were American, 2 were from England, and 1 from Ireland. Between 1765 and 1779, there were a further 112 American graduates. And in 1787, during the American War of Independence, there were 19 graduates from Scotland, 9 from England, 10 from Ireland, and 6 from America, making a total of 44 for the year. Between 1790 and 1799, there were 394 medical graduations from 5,944 matriculated students. Medicine accounted for 43% of all matriculations. So medicine was a very popular subject in Edinburgh at the time. Edinburgh attracted the nonconformist students from England and some American colonies because it didn't have the same establishment rules as the English universities, where you had to have an oath of allegiance to the Church of England. Quakers and others from American colonies went. And the first American graduate recorded in Edinburgh was John Moultrie from South Carolina. His father had been born in Scotland, but had emigrated to America and practiced medicine in Charleston, as well as growing indigo and cotton. His son wanted to study medicine, so he sent him to Edinburgh. His voyage to Bristol took 32 days, and during which they were chased 19 hours off Ireland by a Spaniard. So they had adventures going over. He became a member of the Medical Society in December 1747 and was one of 10 members who joined that year. So they were getting numbers going through. Benjamin Rush from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, undertook a 5-year apprenticeship with John Redman, a Leiden-trained physician, before crossing the Atlantic in 1766. He arrived in Liverpool on the 21st of October after a voyage of at least 52 days, including almost being shipwrecked off the Holyhead in Wales. And he comments, he suffered much from seasickness, but he found relief in laudanum. His cabin companions for the voyage were Jonathan Potts, another medical student from Pennsylvania, and a young Scottish merchant, James Cummings, who was returning to his parents in Scotland because his fortune and health had been impaired in the West Indies. 2 days after landing, Rush and Potts were awoken by the sound coming from their roommate, who was having a convulsion. They checked him and got the best physician in town to treat him, but he died within 24 hours. Rush then had to arrange the funeral for his newly found friend and settle his affairs before taking the stagecoach to Edinburgh to begin his studies. Travel was difficult in those days, and in 1771, Silas Neville, who was an English student from Norwich, spent 2 weeks going around medical people in the area to get letters of recommendation before going to Edinburgh. One person advised that he should only study anatomy in Edinburgh because other subjects such as chemistry were not studied in English universities. And it was no uncommon thing that Oxford and Cambridge physicians would prescribe things that wouldn't mix because they didn't understand the chemistry. I mentioned Neville because he took 6 days to go by stagecoach from East Anglia to Edinburgh. So six days in a stagecoach to get to Edinburgh. Newly arrived students would first need to find accommodation. Rush went to several lodgings and boarding houses, many of them very dirty, before finding suitable accommodation. John Moutry managed to find a house where there is 7 sober young students, which cost him £5, 10 shillings per quarter. 25 years later, Thomas Park, another American from Pennsylvania, wrote, "The afternoon I spent looking for lodgings, which I found very dear. I took a room on the first floor for which I am to pay £12 per quarter." Inflation. It was in a large house and comfortable, but they'd taken a large number of lodgers, there being no less than 10 of us when we were all at home. Also in 1771, Thomas Ismay from Yorkshire boarded with an old gentlewoman opposite the college. Her husband had been dead some years, and he was a professor at the college. There were 2 gentlemen in the house who board also, and he paid £10 per quarter, which is the lowest one can get boarded in a genteel manner. Benjamin Rush arrived in Edinburgh after his travels on the 1st of November 1766, and after finding lodgings, began waiting upon the professors in the college. And as the classes were set down, I procured tickets from each of them to attend their lectures. Waiting on the professors usually entailed presenting letters of introduction from previous students. Rush and Potts each took one from William Cullen. Each took one for William Cullen from John Morgan, who graduated in Edinburgh in 1763. Cullen, having read the letter, took each of them us by the hand, welcomed us to the college. So have your letters. Benjamin Franklin also gave a letter to Rush, but he took care to warn him that letters of recommendation may serve a stranger for a day or two, but where he is to reside for years, he must depend on his own conduct, which will either increase or totally destroy the effect of such letters. Wise advice. Once established, the students had to decide what classes to attend. For example, in 1771, Park, a Quaker from Philadelphia, first met all the professors socially and attended their introductory lectures, which were open to all students. And since the income for professors was derived from a 3-guinea fee from each student, it was obviously advantageous to attract as many students as possible by making a good impression at the initial free lecture. Park details his first day. At 8 a.m., Dr. Holmes accosted the medical tribe in his apartment in the most important and engaging manner he was capable of, which, to be sure, was not much. At 9 a.m., Dr. Cullen, the inimitable Cullen, I say, addressed his whole class in the warmest manner words could express. Dr. Black delivered his introduction to his chemistry at 10 a.m. Good language and very instructive, but I blush for his delivery. It was Black who discovered or first described latent heat. At 11 a.m., the sensible Gregory gave a pathetic discourse on the advantages of the Institutes of Medicine. 1 p.m. went to Munro's Anatomical Theatre, where I beheld the greatest collection of medical students, upwards of 200, and the most elegant theatre there is in any one place in Europe, I suppose. And the doctor is certainly the best orator. Then at home till 4 p.m. when I went to Mr. Young's introductory lecture on his course of midwifery. A tolerable discourse, but I blush for his delivery, and I'm not sure that's his verbal delivery or his deliveries of babies. And there is the class card, which they got when they paid their 3 guineas. They had their class card, which was entabled to go. And this, of course, is for anatomy lectures using the Vesalius picture. In the same year, Thomas Ismay went to see Munro Secundus, and this would be Munro Secundus as well. He has a fine theatre where he gives his lectures. He has about 300 pupils who paid 3 guineas each, so you may judge his yearly income. Besides, he is called to all extraordinary cases in town. Generally, when a person is given up by the physicians, Dr. Munro is called in. Commenting on the Edinburgh Medical School, Ismay wrote, "It's supposed to be one of the first universities in Europe for physics in Europe. I suppose there may be 500 to 600 students of physics, which consist of Scotch, English, French, Dutch, Irish, and from almost every other kingdom in Europe, besides a great many from America." His timetable was very full. I rise about 7, read until 9, then go to Dr. Cullen's class, come back at 10, then breakfast, and transcribe the notes that I've taken in his lecture. From 12 to 1, I walk in the infirmary. From 1 to 3, attend Dr. Munro, then come and dine. And as you may suppose, I'm very hungry. From 4 to 5, attend Dr. Young. From 5 to 6, transcribe the notes I've taken for Dr. Young and Dr. Munro's lectures. From 6 to 7, I attend Dr. Innes's private demonstrations. From 7 to 9, transcribe the lectures I have borrowed. And at 9, get supper. From 10 till 12, write lectures. Besides, on every Tuesday and Thursday from 5 o'clock to 6 o'clock, I attend the clinical lectures. He details the fees for his lectures. It was not cheap to be a medical student. To go to Cullen, he had his 3 guineas, and he had to pay 2 shillings for a servant, 3 guineas to Munro, half a crown for the janitor, 2 shillings to the under janitor, and to Mr. Young, course of midwifery, another 3 guineas, 10 and 6pence for the lying in ward, and only a shilling for the servant there. And then Mr. Munro, Innes Munro's dissector, that was a guinea, that was the lecture in the evenings. He was actually very good because he would really work people through the anatomy. And then he's going on the wards, another 3 guineas for the walking, and 3 guineas for the clinical lectures, and again 3 and 6pence to the porter and the library. So that in total, that is about £10–12 just to be a student for the session of this, and there were 2 sessions in the year. When I consider the money that it will cost me during my stay at this place, it makes me confine myself too closely to my study, more so than seems conducive to my health. He was a Yorkshireman, by the way. Samuel Bard from New York joined the Medical Society in 1763 and recorded that his rough notes from Dr. Cullen's account of the vitriolic acid, which were taken from his mouth, amounted to 20 quarto pages, which, if I was to attempt to copy and correct, would be considerably increased. This exercise of copying my notes is a task I reserve for the summer. He used his evenings to do some practical anatomy in order that I might be enabled to go over his Monroe's lectures with advantage. I bought some old bones, which I met with by accident. I frequently improve myself in this fundamental part of my profession. Study comparative anatomy by dissecting in my own rooms the parts of quadrupeds. And yesterday I dissected the brain of a sheep, and today an ox's eye. So they're doing a lot of work to further their studies. And in order to graduate, the student had to first have a certificate of lectures, which he had attended, and this had to be presented before he was allotted the examinations. Bard described his examination experience. On the first day, not the distant hint of what was to be the subject of my trial. I went in trembling, and Dr. Cullen desired me to sit down. Began my examination by asking me some general definitions, such as quid est medicina. My next trial was writing commentaries upon 2 of Hippocrates' aphorisms and defending them against old Dr. Monroe and Dr. Cullen. My last private trial was writing commentaries upon 2 practical cases. The students also had to write a thesis in Latin, which John Ravenscroft from Virginia presented and when John Ravenscroft presented his first draft to Dr. Gregory in March 1770, he was told to rewrite it. I was obligated in a manner to do it all afresh, and writing 2 or 3 times over 15 folio pages is no small drink. Many students found it difficult to write Latin, and Ravenscroft reported, disputing pedant who reads Latin with me and has the knack of, ere I'm aware, of drawing me into a dispute. We commonly begin in Latin, but it's not very long before plain English becomes a vehicle of sentiment between us. The thesis had to be presented as a printed book. And there is Rush's thesis, and they obviously had academic typographers, because it's printed at that, they just specialized in printing these theses, and there are probably only 20 or 30 or 40 theses a year. And Silas Neville records in September 1775, I've been very busy with my printing for some days, and from the kind of types I use, pica, being much occupied, I'm afraid I shall not get it done in time. As one who prints, I can empathize, because what he means is that they didn't have type casting machines. They couldn't cast more type. They had to take the type down that they'd printed the previous thing and cast it again. That's the shortage. That's what he means by it being much occupied. At the printing office, correcting the press until 10 o'clock. Until this day, a proof was sent to me every night. He had his first examination of his cases on Monday, the 4th of September, and felt he'd given tolerable satisfaction. The following week, he visited his oral examiner because he thought it right to call upon him and tell him that I was glad I had fallen into such good hands. He told me he was preparing to attack me, but found I was so well guarded that he could hardly find anything to object to, because he'd read his thesis and he'd done it well. At the public examination the following day, The examiner made only 2 observations, but it pleased God to strengthen me to give proper answers, even in public. The examiner concluded with the comment that it was bene elegante et erudite script. The candidates each received their degree of Doctor of Medicine, and the principal and professors gave their hands as brethren. Benjamin Rush attended lectures on anatomy, chemistry, Institutes of Medicine, Natural Philosophy, and also the practice at the infirmary. In some revised, and he commented that during the summer he would try to master the French language and gain a reading knowledge of Spanish and Italian. So they were certainly working very hard. He joined the Medical Society in March 1767 and was one of 21 members who joined that year. And he describes his examination experience. On the first day, I had no distant hint of what was to be the subject of my trial. Drs. Cullen and Monroe, secundus, were his examiners, and the questions ranged from quid est medicina, obviously a basic question, you come in, what's medicine? Then he was asked about the stomach, the structure of the stomach and the alimentary tract, to the pulse of inflammations. The whole examination lasted 45 minutes. He then had to write commentaries upon 2 of Hippocrates' aphorisms and defend them against Monroe Primus and Cullen, which took up an hour. My last private trial was writing commentaries upon 2 practical cases, much the same as manner which I sent when I wrote for the Medical Society, and he defended against those. Rush was admitted to the degree of Doctor of Medicine on June 1768, after having examined the usual examinations and defended the thesis. He wrote after he'd passed, the 2 years I spent in Edinburgh, I consider as the most important in their influence upon my character and conduct in any period of my life. Edward Topham, not a medical student, an English visitor to Edinburgh in 1775, wrote, "The University of Edinburgh is celebrated throughout Europe for its instruction in particular branches of philosophy and literature. The number of young persons that crowd here from different countries is prodigious, and the profit arising from it is sensibly perceived through all Scotland, as they contribute to the support of many thousands of its inhabitants in supplying either their necessities or luxuries by their manufactures and industry." His views on the medical school were varied. I have attended some of the professors' lectures and found them so much entertainment that I propose for the future spending some hours with them every day. But I cannot say their company are the most agreeable companions. The Scottish students not being so remarkable for their cleanliness and politeness as for their poverty, famine, and science. I must just tell you, therefore, that every professor has his room or theatre, which is surrounded by benches, which have desks before them for the students to write and take notes, and the professor stands or seated in the middle as a best adopted to the purpose of his lecture. Most of the professors wear gowns, like those of our universities, meaning Oxford and Cambridge, and their lecture is generally lasts about 3/4 of an hour. The professor of anatomy is the most frequented of any of the professors, as it is necessary for the votaries of Asclepius to have a competent knowledge of this as a foundation and groundwork for other sorts of physic. Dr. Monroe has all the advantages of a great orator, full of strength and force of expression, round and manly in his periods, emphatical and bold in his manner of delivery. He particularly avoids that familiarity which so many of the professors are apt to fall into in their lectures, and which seems to degrade their dignity by making them an air of common conversation. And for this reason, he appears to many to excel more in the physiological than in any other part of anatomy. Looking back in John Morgan, in his thesis of 1763, hoped, "In the distant reaches of America, they will come to my mind and relieve me from time to time, and relive for me from time to time the beloved memory of my studies at Edinburgh, where all that delights and improves the mind is available. Benjamin Rush stated before leaving Edinburgh, the public lectures and private conversations of the professors not only gave me many new ideas, but opened my mind to enable me to profit by reading and observations. Oh, this slide I showed just to say that the printing goes, I printed this for my wife's PhD, so hand printing still goes on today. This was her title page, which we got put. I didn't hand set the 450 pages of PhD, but I did print the title page. Now, this table, which was produced in 1936, shows the number of matriculates, the top line, and the number of graduates, the bottom line, at the University of Edinburgh between 1763 and 1858. And I think that shows that the large number of people went to Edinburgh for the experience, and very few went to graduate. But they gained, I think, a lot from Edinburgh. Perhaps they, as we've heard, it's a very expensive place. And if you had to spend 4 years there, you'd need a lot of money to do that. And the final comment I would like to give was made in a letter on the study of medicine and on the medical character addressed to a student by Peter Reed, who was an Edinburgh graduate. And he wrote this in 1809, just outside the period I'm talking about. Most of those studies with which you must be conversant have nothing to do with the arts of eloquence, and rather require habits of action and calm reflection than powers of expression and a turn for smartness of debate. Indeed, no quality is more likely to stand in the way of your studies than a propensity to speechify, a love of disputation, always hunting after cavils, and that strife of tongues where the whole contention is for victory rather than for truth. Wise advice to medical students. But I suspect if they'd been to the medical societies and debated, they didn't always get what was going to be good for them. Thank you.
Okay, questions. I've got a first question. You mentioned, of course, that the lectures and the examination were all in Latin.
Yeah.
Do you have a sense? One of the things that is said about Latin is that it's elitist. Do you have a sense that the students that you're talking about at the medical school were of a better class of student than those who were the apothecary surgeons? Because in order to do Latin at university level, they would have had to have studied Latin at school or some sort of grammar school, which obviously the apothecary surgeon candidates would not have done. So do you think it was an elitist thing?
Well, I mean, it was to a question, but it was to a point that Latin, I mean, if you'd been to a school, you'd need to go to school to go to university. I mean, anybody. So that they would go to the grammar school, which was set up to teach you Latin. Yes. So they'd have them, but there were people who would do the teaching, as one of the people have talked about. That he had his tutor who tutored him, and one of the tutors was John Brown. Now, John Brown was an Edinburgh student who was very proficient in Latin and would write people's theses. But he developed his theory, which was in opposition to Cullen's theory. So for 20 or 30 years in the later part of the 18th century, there was the argument between the Brunonians and the others. And Brown was eventually discredited and disappeared from the scene. So, yeah, I think in order to have the money to go, it was elitist. I think Silas Neville was an interesting case in point, because not a lot's known about where his father got his money. He was orphaned before he went to university, but he had an incredible time, and his diary is very good. He's got a diary covering his period of being a student, but he lived to be 99.
I presume that the surgeon apothecaries were being educated in parallel with the medical students, and they would have had to walk the wards for 2 or 3 years in the infirmary.
Yeah,
so
yeah, that was later. That
was a separate stream, was it?
That was well, no, the surgeon, no, because the surgeons, I mean, the surgeons and the still trained, I mean, up until the 1930s, you could get your medical degree either through the College of Physicians, College of Surgeons, or through the university. And in fact, when we graduated, the London people would go to London and get their LRCP, MRCS, and then take the MBCHB degree. So that was, we had this dual, there was the dual system of training.
I've also got a question about Benjamin Rush.
Oh, yes.
When you were talking about him, I always think of him as a bleeder. He was very famous for being very enthusiastic for bleeding people. In fact, he was said to have hastened the demise of Thomas Jefferson. You know, he took him to death's door and pulled him through. So was bleeding was the standard treatment.
Bleeding was the standard treatment. What I didn't put in was that the Rush's companion on the boat who died, they'd actually bled him. The first thing, and they were. I mean, okay, they'd done an apprenticeship before they went, but they bled him and then called somebody else. And then there was another thing I came across when I was looking through the Scots magazine. There was a little piece which said that 3 workmen had fallen off a building near the infirmary. So the infirmary people came out and bled them. They were lying seemingly dead on the ground, and they bled them, and they took them in, and there was an appeal, and they were funded, and they survived. So bleeding was very much the sort of thing of first choice.
Yes.
John, having spent my training period in surgery, or part of it in Aberdeen, what was the situation in those years regarding the status of those Scottish universities? Did some of the people from British Commonwealth countries and around the world and from Europe, did they go to the other universities, or did Edinburgh really have the prime place?
I think Edinburgh was the preferred one. I haven't looked in as much depth as to what went on in other places, because my interest in this came because when I was in Edinburgh and had finally a student, and after graduation, the Royal Medical Society had to sell the building that it was in, not the original Surgeons' Hall. They got another. The original Medical Society building was demolished, and they got another building, and that was compulsorily purchased to become the Midlothian Police Headquarters. And so the Royal Medical Society had to move out of its very splendid Victorian rooms and find somewhere to put its library. And the university said, "Well, we'll give you somewhere to put this library." And the library is full of absolute treasures, because a lot of their members had presented their things. There was William Withering's description of foxglove, and there were various other unique books in the collection. And this is where I got into it and read a lot of their journals and thought, yes. So I'm Edinburgh focused, but I'm sure there were similar things, but certainly as the literature mainly describes Edinburgh.
Well, I don't know whether you can remember, it's about, it's about 3 years ago, I covered Dr. Kloss, who is 1 century later than your main theme tonight. And up the road here, we have archives with the cases
Yeah.
carefully recorded.
Yeah.
What about the early surgeons here? Are there records of what they did as surgeons?
I don't know. I really don't know. It's not something I looked into. Perhaps it's something to look into.
They'll be in Latin, of course.
Not here. No, they've stopped using Latin.
Does anyone know about local archives? Other question. Are there any, Chris, are there any questions from the Zoom thing? Okay. Okay, well, I think it just remains for me, John, to say thank you so much for a wonderful presentation, and please join me in thanking